Welcome back to Theories of Knowledge, the first collaborative online course for arts and humanities doctoral students across Scotland, brought to you by the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities with support from the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Scottish Funding Council. Theories of Knowledge examines the ways in which philosophers and critical theorists have influenced and indeed continue to animate how we understand knowledge production within the arts and humanities. This evening, Dr. Robert Halsall will speak to us on the work of Peter Sloterdijk. Dr. Robert Halsall is Reader and Research Coordinator in Communication, Marketing, and Media at Robert Gordon University. His areas of research and teaching fall within the fields of cultural and critical theory, intercultural communication, semiotics, postmodern culture, and the aesthetics of media. He is author of The Problem of Autonomy in the works of Hermann Broch, out from Peter Lang in 2000. In addition to work on the Frankfurt School, Jürgen Habermas, and Peter Sloterdijk, Dr. Halsall has written extensively in the field of critical management studies, in which he applies critical discourse analysis to managerialism and neoliberalism. Tonight, Dr. Halsall will introduce us to the work of Peter Sloterdijk through the rubric of Ecologies. If you're joining us remotely this evening, please log into notheory.org and navigate to the Ecologies post on the discussion page to share your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie, for that introduction, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Here in the room, it's Robert Gordon University, and tuning in to this course. As Katie said, I'm here to give a lecture on the work of Peter Sloterdijk in relation to theories of knowledge. Now, until a few years ago, giving a lecture on the works of Sloterdijk in the English-speaking world was quite a difficult undertaking, because apart from a few works, very few of his works were available in translation. He's well known in his native Germany, and he's also quite well known in continental Europe, but the lack of translations meant really that he was not very well known in the UK. So this situation is beginning to be remedied now, as translations have appeared of many of his significant works, and more of these works are being translated at this moment. And it also is the case that scholars in the arts and humanities in the UK are increasingly beginning to apply his work to research in the arts, humanities, and the social sciences. To just mention a few fields which scholars have applied them to already: art and design, architecture, environmental planning, and organisation studies. These have been some studies which have appeared in the last few years. The task of giving an overview of Sloterdijk's work, however, is quite a difficult one, because he is the author of over 50 works. So in 1 hour, I'm trying to give an overview of them. In addition to his published works, Sloterdijk is a high-profile media philosopher, particularly in Germany. And he is famous or infamous for certain public and polemical interventions, which I'll speak about in a few moments. In addition to that, he was a high-profile media celebrity, if you like, as a media philosopher. From 2002 to 2012, he was the host of a philosophical discussion program on ZDF, which is the second German television channel, and he has made many other very frequent media and public appearances. So in this lecture, I'm going to restrict myself to what I see as the most important works relevant to the theory of knowledge. But before doing that, I'd just like to give an overview of the nature of Sloterdijk's work, its wide-ranging and interdisciplinary nature, speak about his style of philosophizing, because the question of his style is very much significant from the point of view of the content of his work, as I'll say in a moment. Just a bit of biographical background for those who are not familiar with him. Sloterdijk was born to a German mother and a Dutch father in 1947. He studied German literature, philosophy and history, and received his doctorate. in 1976, and that was a literary analysis of autobiographies in the Weimar Republic. From 1978 to 1980, he spent 2 years in India studying in the ashram of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. This is very significant for his work because one of the aspects of Sloterdijk's thought is his openness to non-Western perspectives, in particular Indian philosophy. He first came to prominence in Germany in 1983 with the publication of Kritik der cynnischen Vernunft, a critique of cynical reason, which became a bestseller and which I'll deal with in detail in a moment. From 1992, he was Professor of Philosophy and Media Theory at the School of Art and Design in Karlsruhe, and he was also the rector of the art school from 2001 to 2015. Just to speak about influences on his thought, there are many influences on his thought, and one of the criticisms of Sloterdijk's work is that it is eclectic. I think, however, this is a misplaced critique, as the wide range of influences are very much part of his intention, which is to cross disciplines and call into question disciplinary boundaries. This makes things difficult for people who want to classify and pigeonhole theorists. What is Sloterdijk? Is he a philosopher, a cultural theorist, an anthropologist, a literary critic, polemicist? In fact, I believe that he is all of these things. In terms of influences on his thinking, if we were to highlight just a few, first of all, then Nietzsche and Heidegger would be of particular significance. Apart from two specific books, short books on Nietzsche, The Thinker on the Stage, 1986, and On the Improvement of the Good News, Nietzsche's Fifth Gospel, 2000, which was a speech given on the 100th anniversary of Nietzsche's death, references to Nietzsche occur through all of Sloterdijk's significant works like leitmotifs. And in particular, one of the chief concepts that he keeps coming back to is the idea of ressentiment, which Nietzsche employed in the genealogy of morality as part of his critique of religious morality. The nature of ressentiment and its prevalence in modernity has been the theme of particular works of Sloterdijk. For example, Contempt for the Masses, Essays on the Culture Wars, 2000, that hasn't been translated yet, and Rage and Time, which has been translated in 2010. The second major influence on his thought, second major concept from Nietzsche that animates his thought is asceticism. In particular, Nietzsche's view of religions, first and foremost Christianity, as systems of self-denial or withdrawal from the world, or to use the term ascesis. Sloterdijk shares with the later Foucault an interest in asceticism, both in its religious and non-religious forms. But in contrast to Nietzsche, Sloterdijk is not just concerned with what Nietzsche saw as the pathological aspects of asceticism, but its cultural significance for human systems of exercise and discipline, what he calls in his 2013 work, You Must Change Your Life, Anthropotectics. I'm not going to talk in detail about that book, but I'll just mention that as an example of his influence of Nietzsche. So in this work and other works, he follows in the tradition of Pierre Hadot's studies of spiritual exercises in ancient Greece and the later works of Foucault, such as The Care of the Self and the Hermeneutics of the Subject. So he shares that interest in asceticism. The other major influence on Sloterdijk's work is Heidegger, whose ambivalent and for some fatally tarnished reputation has of course been a subject of controversy both within Germany and the rest of Europe. Sloterdijk's critical engagement with Heidegger is collected in the essay volume Not Saved, Essays on Heidegger, 2001. As the title of the book implies, it's not an attempt to save Heidegger from this reputation, but to bring out certain aspects of Heidegger's thought which inspire Sloterdijk's own. In particular, Heidegger's relationship with spatiality and place, which are key inspirations for Sloterdijk's Spheres trilogy, which I will speak about in more detail later. In Heidegger's Being and Time, in the existential analytic of Dasein's being in the world, space is an important, if underdeveloped, aspect of existence in comparison to time. In Heidegger's later works, that analysis of space and place is extended. Sloterdijk's aim in the Spheres trilogy, as he says in its introduction, is to develop this concern with space further to the extent that spheres can be seen as a complement, being and space, to Heidegger's Being and Time. Next slide. The third major influence on Sloterdijk's thought, on which I'll not elaborate in detail, but I will mention, is the tradition of philosophical anthropology, particularly in the work of Max Scheler, Helmut Plessner, and Arnold Gehlen. For these theorists, following on from Nietzsche, the human being is characterized by an existential duality. On the one hand, situated in the world, and at the same time able to detach from it, able to withdraw from it, and to see him or herself as a thing among other things, and then to be able to return to the world, or to use an important Sloterdijkian metaphor, to be born to the world. There is a book, Sloterdijk's, which has that in the title. So philosophical anthropology is very much an influence on his works. Just to mention two in particular, I mentioned Spheres trilogy, but Weltfremdheit, Unworldliness, 1993, that hasn't been translated as yet, is a key work from the point of view of this idea of coming to the world. Okay, finally, before I start talk about the individual works, this is the next slide, a bit of a comment about his style. He is very critical of the dry academic style of which some academic philosophy consists. As with Nietzsche, Sloterdijk often adopts a literary, metaphorical, and in some places apodictic style. He often writes in a deliberately provocative and polemical way, which has often embroiled him in controversy in Germany, as I'll mention in a moment. The style and the tone of his works, however, I think are an essential part of the nature of his thought, which is to question accepted truths and to ignore disciplinary boundaries. As the translator of Sloterdijk's Spheres trilogy into English, Wieland Hoban, remarks on his essay on Sloterdijk's style in the volume Sloterdijk Now, he says, to look at a text by Sloterdijk is not the same kind of thing as to look at a text by Habermas or Axel Honneth. He is highly metaphorical, has a literary style, and this leads some critics to dismiss him as a mere essayist. Many of the chapter titles of his books are deliberately cryptic and colourful, and many of the works, particularly Critique of Cynical Reason and Spheres, employ illustrations. The slide shows 2 pages here from the left from Critique of Cynical Reason and right from volume 1 of Spheres. So illustrations, works of art, those kind of things, you can find a lot of those things, illustrations, within his works. Okay, so these illustrations are meant to amplify, to evoke and provoke the reader to make connections beyond just the written word. Just to finish these comments on his style, these critical comments should not prevent us, however, I think, from engaging with his ideas. But perhaps, as Wieland Hoban says, philosophical precision and depth are not equally pronounced in all areas of his work. Although the works that I'm going to talk about tonight, I think, are amongst the most significant works of Sloterdijk. Let's come back to his public profile. As I said, he's a high-profile intellectual in Germany, and that is a country in which intellectuals still play a prominent role in the media, often commenting on political events. His interventions in the public sphere have often been seen as provocations and have generated controversy. Let me just mention two examples of that. In 1999, Sloterdijk gave a speech entitled Rules for the Human Zoo, which consisted of a reply to Heidegger's Letter on Humanism. Letter on Humanism was published in 1947. In the course of this, which muses on the nature of humanism in the late 20th century, particularly on the decline in humanistic education and the increased ability to manipulate the human genome, Sloterdijk appeared to some to be suggesting a use of genetics as part of the, quote, taming of the human species alluded to in the title of the speech. Such a suggestion, if that is what Sloterdijk was attempting to do, is of course an extremely sensitive subject in Germany, and that speech evoked a strong reaction from other intellectuals in Germany, particularly Jürgen Habermas, Ernst Tugendhat and Manfred Frank, all published articles attacking Sloterdijk and accusing Sloterdijk of advocating a liberal eugenics. In reply to that, Sloterdijk published an article entitled Critical Theory is Dead, in which he accused his critics, particularly Habermas, of demonizing him, misconstruing his arguments and conducting a media campaign against him. He related this to the dead tradition of Frankfurt School critical theory, which he saw as a force controlling and stifling intellectual debate in post-war Germany. The second case, which I'd like to mention, is in June 2009. He wrote an article for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung entitled Die Revolution der gebenden Hand, the Revolution of the Giving Hand, in which he appeared to advocate or to attack one of the fundamental pillars of post-war Germany's social market economy, the right of the state to levy tax in order to redistribute wealth to the less off, which many in Germany see as a means of ensuring a stable social democracy. This intervention also provoked responses from other leading German intellectuals, including Axel Honneth, who is the present director of the Frankfurt School of Social Research. In citing these examples of controversy, I don't want to go into further into the nature of the debates and nor the importance of media in it, but to point out that Sloterdijk has a provocative and polemical element to his thought, and that for some in Germany, his apparent willingness to take positions in order to court controversy discounts him from being considered a serious philosopher. I do not think we need to come to this conclusion, even though we may disagree with the stances he has taken. Okay, I'd like now to move on to talk about the particular works of Sloterdijk, which I am going to talk about this evening. And as I said, we've got 50 works to deal with. I'm going to concentrate on two of his more significant works. The first is Critique of Cynical Reason, which I've already mentioned, and the second one will be the Spheres trilogy. So if we can have the next slide. Yeah, that's it. Sorry, thanks. Okay, right. Critique of Cynical Reason, as I said, was written in 1983. This is the beginning of his career. And Spheres, volumes 1 to 3, were published in 1998 to 2004 in Germany. Now, the translations which you can see on the slide, Critique of Cynical Reason has been available for some time, and the 3 volumes of Spheres, Bubbles, Globes, and Forms, the first 2 have already appeared in translation, and the third, Forms, is going to appear, I believe, in October. And I'm also going to be mentioning in the World Interior of Capital, which is really a kind of supplement, if you like, to volume 2 of Spheres, because it deals with macrosphereology. Yeah. Okay, let's start off with talking about Critique of Cynical Reason. This is seen by many people as the most significant and successful work of Sloterdijk. The title, of course, alludes to, as you have no doubt mentioned in previous lectures on this course of theories of knowledge, to the critiques produced by Kant, in particular the critique of pure reason. Kant's critiques were concerned with the possibilities of knowledge, whether of the external world through the senses and reason, moral knowledge, and aesthetic knowledge. Sloterdijk's critique of cynical reason is also concerned with knowledge, in particular the possibilities of critical knowledge and ideological critique, given the changes in the world which had taken place in the later 20th century. To that extent, I think you can see a parallel with works such as Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition, 1979, or Jameson's Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, 1991. In contrast to these works, however, Sloterdijk does not employ the word postmodern. He is, however, analysing a particular point in history and politics, and that is the demise and disillusionment of the promise which many people had seen in the 1968 student revolts and the generation of critical thinkers associated with that, in particular in Germany, the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. Just two of the most important elements of that critique, stemming from the work of Marx and then continued in Adorno and Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment, are false consciousness and reification. False consciousness postulates that the subject is naive. What they take to be social reality, their understanding of the world, is an illusion brought about by ideology, a failure to recognize the truth of the situation brought about by the ideology of capitalism. It is this illusion, this naivety about naivety, which the critique of critical theory is designed to enlighten the subject about. Similarly, reification, the idea that the human subject is reduced to a thing, a commodity, is something which ideology critique is supposed to bring to the consciousness of the subject. So implicit in these two views, then, is that the subject does not know what they do. To quote Marx's famous dictum, they do not know it, but they are doing it. The analysis of cynicism in Sloterdijk's critique of cynical reason, however, is ultimately more indebted to Nietzsche than Marx. As Andreas Huyssen says in the introduction to the English translation, it focuses not on reification through the commodity form, but on reification of self and other in presumably enlightened discourse practices. Sloterdijk, in other words, is more concerned with the consciousness and knowledge of the participants in cultural discourse than with the structures of production or consumption of culture as such. The consciousness which has emerged in the late 20th century, as Sloterdijk argues, is not naive, not ignorant of its own state of illusion, but aware of it and cynical about the process of enlightenment and ideology critique. And Sloterdijk defines this prevalent form of cynicism as enlightened false consciousness. So just a quotation from Critique of Cynical Reason. Cynicism is enlightened false consciousness. It is that modernized, unhappy consciousness on which enlightenment has labored, both successfully and in vain. It has learned lessons in enlightenment, but it has not, probably, and was not able to put them into practice. Well off and miserable at the same time, this consciousness no longer feels affected by any critique of ideology. Its falseness is already reflexively buffered. End of quotation. So, Sloterdijk's project is to examine the epistemological and psychological nature of this reflexively buffered, enlightened false consciousness in contemporary cultural discourse, and to examine how the cynic uses awareness gained from the process of enlightenment to turn this awareness against the aims of enlightenment itself. Just to give a kind of parallel some of the ideas that Sloterdijk is talking about in the book, there are two kind of features of enlightenment which are subject to critique in the book. First of all is the ideal of consensus, and the idea that participants in enlightenment dialogue supposedly voluntarily subscribe to consensus as an outcome of the project. So, for instance, in Habermas's theory of communicative action, which is produced around the same time as this, 1984, the ideal of consensus as the outcome of dialogue is what that is all about. Yeah. Okay. So, in this respect, then, Sloterdijk, I think, is continuing in the line of Adorno and Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment, but he's definitely not subscribing himself to the project of critical theory. I think you can also see a parallel between this idea and what Lyotard is looking at in the postmodern condition, which is a skepticism about narratives of emancipation. Okay, can I just mention a few examples of where this kind of critique of cynicism has been applied in various fields? In the fields of media and communication, cultural studies, politics, management and organizational studies has been applied, for instance, to consumers of media products in the field of advertising and the consumer themselves, how a kind of enlightened false consciousness is part of the consumption process. In politics, the analysis of political cynicism, cynicism of voters about politicians, political parties. Timothy Bewes, in his Cynicism and Postmodernity, has a substantial to say on that. And in management and organizational studies, which is the area I have written on, Peter Fleming and Andre Spicer's 2003 article, Working at a Cynical Distance, talks about how employees in organizations become cynical about management and the management communication process. All three of those areas as examples of where Sloterdijk's insight have been looked at. But there is another aspect, an important aspect of the critique of cynical reason, and that is to counterbalance perhaps this pessimistic analysis of cynicism as enlightened false consciousness. Sloterdijk contrasts this with a second form of cynicism, which is still able to fulfill a critical function, which he refers to, this is the next slide, which he refers to by its original Greek name, cynicism, as practiced by its originator, Diogenes of Sinope. So you have on the left there, Diogenes as pictured in Raphael's School of Athens. Cynicism is a gestural critique, a critique which uses the tools of cheek, mockery, and irony for the purpose of critique. It is essentially existential, bodily, and is directed at showing rather than arguing for the falseness of official ideologies. The slide, a picture on the left, right there is Diogenes going through the marketplace in Athens with a lantern in broad daylight looking for honest men. That's because there aren't any there. So that's the reason he's looking for them in daylight. Okay, so that is an example of the kind of bodily, cheeky, ironic kind of critique which Sloterdijk is calling cynicism. So it is a kind of embodied critique in the person, which is really going against the prevailing ideologies, as in the case of that. Excuse me a second. Yeah. Okay. Can I just talk about the second aspect of cynical critique? Cynicism, then, is in contrast to the high theory of critical theory and enlightenment, is low theory. In some respects, it is connected to the Bakhtin's notion of the carnivalesque, and the elements of the carnivalesque and the cynical have been identified by various theorists as prevalent in aspects of contemporary culture, including subcultural style and fashion, hedonism, enjoyment, and pleasure. However, Sloterdijk emphasizes that cynicism uses cheek, mockery, and irony for a moral and even a political purpose. The question for cultural studies is whether those cultural forms contemporary cultural forms which are, might have a clinical content are truly clinical in that sense, or have they become disconnected from any kind of moral or political purpose? Okay, just finishing off on critique of cynical reason then, it appears then that the book is a critique or a rejection of Enlightenment reason, and in particular a counterpole to the work of someone like Habermas's theory of communicative action, which, as I said, that work has an emphasis on the ideals of consensus, deliberation, and rationality. Critique of cynical reason can also, however, I think, be seen as an attempt to save the tradition of critique and the idea of dialogue. As Sloterdijk says in the introduction of the book, I'll just read this quotation here, it is tempting to poke fun at the methodological anti-realism of the dialogue idea, and part of this book, indeed, tries to help the derisive laughter about every form of foolish idealism. However, when all contradictions have been taken into account, one will return here to the beginning, of course, with a consciousness that has gone through all the hells of realism. To preserve this healing fiction of a free dialogue is one of the last tasks of philosophy. Okay, I'd like now to move on to the Spheres trilogy, which is going to be the main section of what I'm going to be talking about. So we do take a leap forward now in terms of time from the early 1980s to the late 90s and early 2000s, and we come to what many people regard as his magnum opus, the Spheres trilogy. There is, however, a connection between Critique of Cynical Reason and Spheres, in the sense that if the first book was a critique of the possibilities of knowledge in the modern world, then Spheres is also has as its heart a form of human knowledge, and that is the human knowledge of space. Just to go back to Kant for a moment, of course, in the Critique of Pure Reason, for Kant, space was one of the two modes of experiencing the world, along with time. But for Kant and for Descartes, Leibniz and Newton, what they understand as space, which human beings have knowledge, is an abstract geometrical space, not really space as experienced, a phenomenon experienced by human beings in concrete environments. What Edward Casey, in his book The Fate of Place, calls emplacement. It is not until the 20th century, with the advent of phenomenology in the work of Husserl and Heidegger, and later in the work of Bachelard and Hermann Schmitz, that space as experienced and lived in becomes the focus of philosophical inquiry. The fundamental importance of space to human beings is, as I said earlier, present in Heidegger's Being and Time. So the idea that Heidegger puts forward there is that human spatiality comes not from a Cartesian subject being suspended in objectively presented space, but we are ontologically part of being in the world. We cannot deny that, and that being in the world consists of making space relevant for us, of being concerned with space by means of the processes which Heidegger calls directing and disseverance, bringing things close to us and making things further away from us. So these procedures are the way that human beings turn space, human space, into place, or as Sloterdijk is going to call them, into spheres, by bringing near to us what is distant and by lending significance to that which is close to us. The second element of phenomenology which we need to understand the Spheres trilogy is the idea of the fluid boundary between the inside, the feeling of nearness and intimacy, which comes, for instance, in the dwelling or the familiar place, and the outside, the feeling of vastness, unfamiliarity associated with places outside this familiar environment. Here, the poetics of imagination play a vital role in mediating the nature of space. I mentioned Bachelard's Poetics of Space here, because for Bachelard, inside and outside are not opposites in geometrical space, but complementary in the imaginative space of the poet. Bachelard, for instance, looks at the work of Rilke and Baudelaire and others, showing how these kind of spatial categories merge in this way. Yeah. So the idea that the boundaries between the inside or the interior and the exterior are constantly evolving, merging, that is one of the fundamental insights from which the Spheres trilogy is going to be departing from. Okay, I'd like to go on now to talk about what the sphere is, and I'm talking now about volume 1 of Spheres, which is bubbles. As I said, I think this is an extension of the phenomenological project of Heidegger, Bachelard, Schmidt, and others, this is the basis of the Spheres trilogy. Let me just, first of all, cite his definition of what is a sphere. This is from volume 1, page 45. What is here termed a sphere is, first, in a first and provisional understanding, an orb in two halves, polarized and differentiated from the start, yet nevertheless intimately joined, subjective and subject to experience, a biune, shared space of present and past experience. End of quotation. First, the sphere is an orb, a circular enclosed shape. It's an interior space. It's differentiated from the exterior by means of thin walls. It is subjectivized, meaning that the experiences of its inhabitants give it meaning, an atmosphere or a climate. It's inhabited by at least two people. In other words, this is an extension of what Heidegger in Being and Time calls Mitsein, being with others. If we move on, look at the next slide, please. We have two examples here which actually occur in volume 1 of Spheres. On the left-hand side, you have a panel from Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, and if you can focus just on the bubble there, which appears in the bottom right-hand corner, that illustration is an example which he uses in the book of human beings being enclosed in a bubble. Interestingly enough, that there were two people in it, but it looks like the man is being expelled from that bubble there, and that's the temporary nature of the sphere as a residence. Okay, spheres are what Sloterdijk calls morpho-immunological constructs, or temporary pacts against exteriority. This means, and this is a vital insight, I think, for the topic of ecologies, that, a quotation here, human beings have never lived in a direct relationship with nature. Our relationship with the external world, in other words, is always mediated by spheres. Spaces become spheres, he says, because, quote, human beings have given them form, content, extension, and relative duration. Okay, the sphere in its elementary form can take any dimension, from that of the dwelling, locality, to the nation, and indeed the whole world, as we're going to see in a moment when we talk about macrosphereology. Spheres, or bubbles in this case, are of varying size and duration, and they combine to form forms, which are the subject of the third volume. So the sphere, the bubble, is innately unstable. It is damned to burst, he says. The molds of now bursting are brought about by new themes, new presences, new media. The illustration from Masaccio's expulsion from Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. So the Garden of Eden is a kind of bubble which they have been expelled from, and from the expressions on their face you can see that they're being propelled out into the exterior world, and this is not a pleasant experience for them. So I think that gives the idea that even paradise is a temporary sphere to which the walls at some point are going to be punctured here. Okay, let me move on now to volume 2, which is globes. So volume 1, Bubbles, is what he calls microsphereology. So we are talking about small scale spheres there. But in volume 2, we move from microsphereology to macrosphereology. What globes, in fact, is, in essence, is a history and phenomenology of what we usually call globalization. So, but Sloterdijk's history of globalization, however, is not written from a sociological or economic perspective, which most contemporary theories of globalization are, and of which Sloterdijk is critical, but from a phenomenological perspective, in particular, how people have pictured the world. Representations of the world through globes, orbs, etc. There are many illustrations from the book in this. A key text here for understanding Sloterdijk's thought is Heidegger's essay, The Age of the World Picture. Just to quote one sentence from that, Heidegger says, "The fundamental event of the modern age is the conquest of the world as picture," or image, if you want to translate it that way. What this means then is that actually what is important here is the world grasped as an idea, as a picture, and the volume 2, Globes, is really a history of that process of human picturing of the world from ancient times to the present day. However, if Heidegger emphasizes that this picturing began in modernity, Sloterdijk thinks it goes back further than that. And so going back before the age of terrestrial exploration to metaphysics of the Greeks and in the medieval period to see how people have pictured the world in those areas. Yeah. So what he does in volume 2 then is this history of imagining the world as a sphere in its cosmological, ontological and ultimately metaphysical dimensions. This is what Globes is all about. Yeah? And this is an important paradigm shift, if you like, to the idea that globality and globalization is not just a construction of geographical knowledge gained through travel, or not just construction due to the contemporary interconnected nature of communication media, such as in McLuhan's concept of the global village, but a product of this morpho-immunological conception of the world as sphere. To give an illustration of that, if we could move on to the next slide, I just want to talk about a very interesting passage of Sloterdijk's Globes, which is his exploration of Dante's Inferno. You've got Botticelli's depiction there of Inferno as a kind of conical inverted structure with the 9 circles of hell going down, and on the right hand side there's a contrast there between that and heaven as presented in Botticelli's The Assumption of the Virgin. So in fact, in terms of sphereology, hell is an exact opposite, an exact complement to heaven in that aspect. I missed out purgatory, by the way, which comes in the middle. But what in Sloterdijk's exploration of Dante's Inferno, this is what he calls an anti-sphere, defined as withdrawal from the world sphere, and of course within Dante's medieval religious cosmos, that position is determined by metaphysical beliefs, sin, etc. But Sloterdijk is more interested in the morphological structure of this sphere called hell. I mean, for instance, Dante's Inferno, it has its own cities, such as the city of Dis in cantos 7 to 9, which Sloterdijk points out has a mature urbanistic structure with guilt-specific arrondissements. You know. And at the lowest point of hell, next slide please, is the figure of Satan, who is kind of suspended there. This is Gustave Doré's illustration of it. And Sloterdijk sees this as the epitomization of sphere withdrawal and world deprivation. And he sees this kind of all-round isolation, which is characterized by the figure of Satan, as a characterization of the depressive position. So he's sort of seeing, extrapolating, if you like, out from Dante's macrosphereology to a kind of modern condition of this kind of idea of sphere withdrawal. Could I just move on to the next concept now, which is, let's go forward to the present day, and I'm going to speak briefly about the book, The World Interior of Capital. This is published as a separate book, but it really is a development of his work on globalization in part 2 in Globes. That is actually published as a separate book. In the extracts which I've circulated before, I've extracted one chapter from that called The Crystal Palace, and I'll speak about that in a moment. So, the world interior of capital then is the central, the Crystal Palace is the central metaphor in the world interior of capital, which is an understanding of how the macrosphere of the world has been transformed by expanded horizons of travel, mobility, consumerism, and the world market. The precursor of some of the ideas in the world interior of capital is Walter Benjamin. In the Arcades project, Benjamin develops the idea of the interior. So, characteristic of commodity fetishism in the 19th century, as exemplified in the domestic bourgeois interior, and then its extension in the Paris arcades, department stores, museums, and then in the Crystal Palace in London, 1851. And this process is a gradual process through which the external world is gradually enclosed under glass, and goods and curiosities are displayed for the contemplation and wonderment of the masses. So the interior in Benjamin's Arcades project became the place of collection of the exotic, where artifacts from distant cultures and different times were displayed for contemplation. Okay, so this process of expansion of the interior outwards and the interiorization of the world found its highest form in the world exhibitions such as that held in the Crystal Palace in 1851. Okay, so the idea of a vast transparent shell in which it appeared the whole world could be accommodated, this feeling of being inside a kind of world interior of capital is something which then Sloterdijk develops in the book to a critique of the contemporary market and capitalist order from the point of view of this kind of interior forming context. Okay, let me just see how I'm getting on here. Right. But there is another view of the Crystal Palace which Sloterdijk discusses in that chapter, and that is by Dostoevsky. In Dostoevsky's notes from Underground, Dostoevsky, by the way, himself visited the Crystal Palace, but he found it the complete opposite of a kind of utopian space. He saw it as a dystopian nightmare in which all the questions which made human existence meaningful had been measured, predicted, put under glass, and therefore, for him, made meaningless. In discussing contemporary equivalents of this, if we could move on to the next slide, the idea that we are living in a world interior of capital which immunizes the inhabitants against the unpleasantness, unpredictability and threats of the exterior, but in so doing, in some way, compromises its inhabitants, impoverishes them, This is the idea. If we look at the spaces now which are prevalent throughout the world, here are some examples of indoor mega shopping centres in Dubai. These are what George Ritzer calls the temples of consumption. So these would be examples, if you like, of macrosphereology, where the idea is to bring the entire world, as far as possible, into the horizon of consumption, etc. Those are the kind of spaces in which Sloterdijk is talking about in the book. However, we need to be aware that the interior always excludes an exterior. And this includes people who perhaps do not share the living conditions or security of the inhabitants of the Crystal Palace. And since Sloterdijk wrote the book, I think we can see plenty of evidence of its relevance to the present day situation, where there may be many people excluded from the Crystal Palace, from the interior, who, when they try to come into it, to enter it, to become part of that, then walls, fences, etc. are put up in some way to keep them out. So I think this shows the importance of the kind of reflections which Sloterdijk is putting forward in the world interior of capital. Okay, I just want to talk a bit about now the third volume of Spheres, which is Forms. Now, this hasn't yet been published in English. According to the publisher's website, it is due to come out in October. Actually, you maybe have sympathy with the translator of these works because they're some 700 to 800 pages per volume, so that's quite a major undertaking. So that volume is due to come out in October. So I'm just going to give you a preview of that and give you some passages using my translation. The only passage from it which has appeared in English so far was the passage I circulated in advance, which is Form City, which has appeared in New Geographies. Okay, what are forms? We've talked about microsphereology and macrosphereology. Forms, and the subtitle of the book is Plural Sphereology. This is Sloterdijk's central metaphor for how microspheres, or bubbles, combine, interact, and communicate with each other and relate to macrospheres. In other words, this is what sociologists call society. And I'm just translating from page 59 of the German version, which is my translation here. Society can be understood as an aggregate of microspheres, pairs, households, places, associations of differing format, which border one another like the individual bubbles in a pile of foam, and which are layered over and under one another without either being accessible for each other or being able to be effectively separated from one another. So, as the metaphor, that's the end of the quotation, as the metaphor implies, foam is in a constant state of flux as the bubbles combine, burst, and the cells are in a constant motion of imitation and differentiation from each other. There's a key work of influence on volume 3, and that is the French sociologist Gabriel Tarde, who in his 1903 work, The Laws of Imitation, so this is a quotation from Tarde, the social being, in which in the degree that he is social, is equally imitative, and that imitation plays a role in societies analogous to that of heredity in organic life, or to that of vibration amongst inorganic bodies. So what you've got going on within plural sphereology, or form, is a constant dialectic, if you like, of imitation and differentiation. At the one hand, we've got spheres which are trying to become this is the next slide, the slide we've got up there is The Birth of Venus by Botticelli, and she is The Birth of Venus from foam. That is an illustration which appears in in volume 3 of Spheres. So these tendencies within the plural sphereology then, on the one hand, you've got the tendency towards forming monads, self-contained spheres cut off. Sloterdijk here uses Leibniz's term from the monadology. A monad is a kind of self-contained world which is a kind of cut off from others. And on the other hand, you've got processes of imitation and communication with other cells. And cells form themselves into neighborhoods and cities, as you can see in the chapter, form city, just quotation from that, systems of asymmetrical neighborhoods of medium size between intimacy glass houses and self-contained worlds. Form is half transparent, half opaque. Every situation in form can be understood as a combination of circumspection and blindness with respect to one's own bubble. So, no bubble is absolutely isolated from the others. There is always this process of imitation and communication between bubbles. Sloterdijk, in a typical provocative metaphor, refers to Joseph Beuys's famous sentence about every individual being an artist. Sloterdijk says, every individual is not just an artist, but an installation artist. The spheres of form city, then, are reflections of the tendencies in spheres to immunize and separate on the one hand, and to imitate, communicate, and assemble into larger spheres on the other hand. I just want to mention, in the last 5 minutes or so, one section of the book, and that, I think, is the next slide. On the left-hand side, you've got Mediated Egosphere, which is M.C. Escher's picture of self-portrait in a spherical mirror. So the idea of this microsphere entirely as a projection of the ego of the person who's reflected in that. That's one polarity, if you like, of plural sphereology, and the other polarity we're going to speak about in a moment. Yeah, we've already seen examples in volume 2 in the Crystal Palace, or what he calls Comfort Glass House, of one type of island, if you like, an anthropogenic island. What these are, in effect, are places or topoi, or how human activities tend towards place formation. And Sloterdijk categorizes these anthropogenic islands, as he calls them, giving you some examples there. Keratope is the field of operation of the human hands, i.e. touch. Phonotope is the sound container which people inhabit. Uterotope, extension of motherly feelings. Thermotope, which is the taking advantage of herd formations. Ergotope, fatherly or priestly power of definition, including a sensus communis of decorum. Erototope, which is transmission of erotic energies. And aliotope, through which a learning group constitutes itself as part of an experiential continuum. Phonotope, which is the space generated by the ancestors, dead spirits of God. They reveal themselves. And nomotope, in which inhabitants bind themselves to each other through common customs or manners. I just want to talk about one of those, which is the phonotope. And this is the idea that the sound profile of a locality in some sense defines what that place is. So he refers to settlements which emit their own sounds, soundscapes of an individual character, filled with the sounds of life produced by their members, sounds of work, the clatter of appliances and tools, and the murmuring which must accompany all our perceptions. It's that kind of a bubble, if you like, space bubble, which consists of sound, is what he means by phonotope. So I think I'm just about ready to come to the end now. Okay, I'd just like to make a few concluding remarks before opening this to questions. I hope in this lecture to have made the case for the contribution of Sloterdijk's work to a theory of knowledge, which might underpin research motivated by the theme of ecologies. Spheres in particular is a major work which addresses the theme of human beings' essential in-placement, being in the world, relationships with the environment and others, the processes of habitation, and a reciprocal relationship of these with this environment. Sloterdijk, I think, has given us a concept, sphere, and a method, sphereology, which is, with its constituent elements such as immunization, interior and exterior, atmosphere, climate, and anthropogenic islands, which can be applied to a variety of fields. And this application has already begun in fields such as media and communication, organizational studies, art and design, architecture, politics, and others. As I have said, Sloterdijk's work is characterized by a style, breadth, and purposeful disrespect for academic boundaries, which may make it difficult to accept for some and difficult to interpret in some respects. But for a cross-disciplinary approach to knowledge in the arts and humanities, which has been the aim of this course, I believe it can be a productive resource. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll open to questions. I'll open the floor first to the room as we wait for the message board to catch up.
Yeah. Thank you very much, sir. I was just going to ask about the differentiation between abstract space, from Kant back, and then space as lived from Heidegger.
Yeah.
So I didn't catch in clear terms how you made the differentiation.
Okay. Well, what you meant by the phenomenological perspective on space, basically, is working outwards from the individual human being, what it is like to experience space. And in Sloterdijk's work, this means the concept of sphere. This is how we experience space. So rather than working outwards from an abstract category of space, and saying this is what the world is, we're suspended in a kind of objective world. The idea is, we're not actually suspended in objective space. We subjectivize. We live experience, and this is how we perceive space. So what we're doing in sphereology is all the time converting this objective space into kind of intimate, lived spaces. Of course, that's not the only process, as he says, and we've got other processes going on, which is the expansion of spheres. So in macrosphereology, for instance, the world interior of capital is exactly that. Through consumerism, through transportation, etc., the lived experience expands in that way. But of course, the world interior of capital itself, is an unstable entity, because there are people who are excluded from it, and who want to come into it. And also, as we've seen in the last 10 years, the basis of that sphere itself, is unstable. The financial system, the environmental system, etc. Unless we take those into account, that sphere will not be, a sphere of habitation. So I think, the difference between the previous views of space, up to Heidegger, I think, and moving on to Bachelard and Hermann Schmitz, is the idea that the human being, in some sense, has a choice about, their position in the world. Whereas Heidegger's idea is we are in this world ontologically. We cannot escape it. This is part of the human predicament, as it were, and that is the starting point, I think, for the sphereology. So the idea is, let's look at space as experienced from the inside, from the interior, and these kind of differentiations that we make in the act of living. That's what the differentiation is, I think.
Is there some kind of progression through the books from one to foam? And is there some idea that with foam, that because the spheres, you were suggesting a sort of pluralism, I know they're in flux, but is there some normative critique where you think that's better?
When I was talked earlier about Sloterdijk's critique of the Frankfurt School and his kind of skepticism about normative kind of positions, but I think if you read the 3 volumes, you can come to a conclusion that he does see a way, of inhabiting the world in which some kind of profitable relationship can come about. In the world interior of capital, for instance, although in his earlier work, Sloterdijk is definitely setting himself against, the kind of critique of the Marxism and so on. There's quite a lot of critique of capitalism and, the waste of the environment in that book, But if you look at the whole project as a kind of entity, I think what he's trying to do is really give us an adequate way of actually looking at the world through the lens of the sphere, really. It's not really, the normative idea is not foremost in his mind. Because I think he feels that unless we have the, the technique, as it were, to assess this sphereology, we don't want to go and, from the normative perspective, let's look at it from the basic perspective of what a sphere is, and that's what he's trying to actually do, I think.
One of the things that interests me quite a bit about this is that a lot of times if we're talking about, say in the kind of discourses on eco-criticism, we're talking very literally about environment and very kind of materially about environment and about shared environments. And there's a way in which I'm almost tempted to say that Sloterdijk seems to be thinking very abstractly about, that spheres are a metaphor, foams are a metaphor. But actually, I wonder if that's really true. I wonder if you could say a little bit about the biological kind of language and way of thinking at work in this work.
Well, I think if you look at in details at the chapters, there is a definite attempt, I think, to engage with environmental phenomena at that kind of level. But I mean, the fact, as I said earlier on, that he's such a diverse writer. That he's really he's trying to encompass all the ways in which we can master really to look at the nature of the human environment. But I think I would say it is true, and as I said in my opening remarks, some people do criticise Sloterdijk in that he adopts a highly metaphorical kind of language, and if you're reading his works and saying what is the prescription which is coming out of this, then perhaps that's something that perhaps you're not going to get from Sloterdijk. But I think the idea of mapping the human sphereology in its dimensions like this, I think this is an achievement, and that's why I think it's necessary to engage with that as these works.
I have 2 questions from the board. The first has to do with visual art, which you touched upon a little bit, and which is clearly so important to this work. If you looked at even the excerpts that are posted online on the discussion page or in the slides that you showed us today. So here's the question. Thank you for the lecture. I was thinking, as you were mentioning in the conclusion, how does the work of Sloterdijk apply in visual art? Could you say a little bit more about that? Which is to say, not how does visual art apply in Sloterdijk's work, but how might we think about this work as a kind of application or a method for approaching visual art?
Right. Okay. I mean, as you say, he is using visual art and using visual metaphors a lot to explicate these concepts. But I think if we take these kind of terms, such as atmosphere, climate, immunization, and so on, we can actually look at the history of art through this kind of lens. I mean, if I can mention a kind of parallel project to this, and that's the idea of atmospheres I've mentioned the work of Hermann Schmitz, but also people like Gernot Böhmer, who've actually used that as a critical tool to apply to art and to design in particular. And the important thing is that Sloterdijk, as I said, is working in a school of art and design, and I think his works can be and have been applied to that. Probably true more in architecture at the moment and design rather than visual art as such, but there definitely is there. And I didn't mention other of Sloterdijk's works specifically on aesthetics. There's a volume which has been published in Germany called Das Ästhetische Imperativ, which is a collection of his aesthetic writings, and I believe that's being translated now. Polity Press is going to publish that in the near future.
Thank you. Next question from the board. Can we and should we attempt to measure the position and nature of a given sphere along the various parameters discussed? And if so, how? For example, when speaking of internal and external, or of monadic versus social, it is evident that even our capacity to critically interrogate and situate phenomena is itself subjectively mediated.
Right, okay. I think that the basic point, I think, is that if you look at it in terms of polarity, what Sloterdijk is trying to do is, to move outwards from the subjective experience. And that is the kind of polarity, rather than the opposite way around, which is, how is the world objectively given? And in that, I think I would say he's in the line, traditional, as you said, of Husserl, Heidegger, and so on. But I wouldn't say this is all about, just the subjective experience of space. There is a definite attempt, if you like, to address some of the objective problems which are out there. Although Sloterdijk, as a writer, because of his nature as a writer, he's not going to address those issues directly. In his other writings, in his polemical and more journalistic writings, he does address some of those issues. But actually, as I said, because those interventions have been quite controversial, in some sense, I wanted to actually emphasize more, the philosophical works rather than, his kind of comments on the objective world as such. Yeah.
So one more from the board, and this is, I think, something that we haven't touched on yet, which is the question of translation. How much is lost in translation into English? As a literary philosopher, does Sloterdijk play with language in the same way as, say, someone like Derrida?
Yes, not perhaps as much as Derrida, but he certainly does. So I don't envy the task of the translator. But I think Wieland Hoban has done a wonderful job on the first two volumes. The third volume, as I said, of Sphereology is to come. Yes, he has quite a literary style, which is difficult to translate. But if you compare that with the difficulties of translation of Derrida or even Heidegger, it's a different kind of translation problem there. It's not perhaps on that scale. But now, I think, because there seems to be a momentum in terms of, the demand for translations, the books are appearing, I think it's going to be relatively easy for people to access them, in terms. But it's true to say that, as I said earlier in the lecture, one has to become acquainted with Sloterdijk's style, and for some people it is an annoying style, but others see it as something that really does suggest things which other philosophers perhaps don't.
I mean, as someone who reads both in German and in English, and who has read Sloterdijk's work both in German and in English, do you find that philosophically there are differences? Because I don't read German well, but I read German enough to have noticed that, say the work of Husserl, to me, was surprising when I looked at even a little piece of it in the German.
Yeah. One of the things I think that's difficult perhaps is the influences on Sloterdijk, which I mentioned. Particularly people like Plesner, Schiller, and so on, some of those influences are not familiar outside the German-speaking world. So in his kind of cryptic style, it can be difficult to get to those kind of meanings, you know. But it really depends on which works we're talking about, you know, and the style of different works is very different, you know. Some of the shorter works which I mentioned are very much in a kind of terse, kind of almost polemical style, whereas works like Spheres is much more discursive and metaphorical. But he has quite a kind of literary, if you like, style, which does, I think, set problems for the translator, really.
Thank you for your talk. You mentioned that he appears on German television as an intellectual. Could you comment on, is he given comment on anything happening in the world recently?
Yes, that his television show, if you like, yeah. Philosophical Quartet, it was broadcast for about 10 years. It finished a couple of years ago. What that was a television program with 4 people discussing philosophical, political, other issues. Peter Sloterdijk and Rüdiger Safranski were the 2 kind of hosts, and 2 guests. Well, actually, they're all those shows are all available. If you happen to speak German, they're all available on the ZDF website and also on Peter Sloterdijk's own website. Yes, yes, he does speak a lot in public, and as I mentioned, some of those interventions have been quite controversial. The question you have to address, I think, if you're addressing, the public image of Peter Sloterdijk, is how much of this is, a kind of not so much attention speaking, but somehow deliberately stirring up debate, and how much of this is a kind of, a deliberate kind of, try to intervene in public debates. I think I would certainly see it part of his style is to provoke things in a certain way which he doesn't see as being discussed, and that would put him in an opposite camp, I think, to some of the other philosophers in Germany who, as I said, have attacked him and his style. But I wouldn't go to the other extreme of dismissing him because, of what his public interventions. I think one has to look at his works, and to some extent they have to stand by themselves, really.
So what are the controversial things that you've been saying? Yeah.
Well, I mentioned 2 of them there. The rules for human zoo and the intervention on the social market. I think what we have to understand is that the German media is much more a place for intellectual debate and controversy, certainly, than here. And so what tends to happen is a leading thinker or intellectual will publish, either make a speech or publish an article in one of the leading newspapers, and then that will evoke a whole lot of response. Whether you can then try to go into that and say how much of this is a media furor, and how much of this is a genuine kind of debate about the issues. But I'll go back to my contrast with Sloterdijk and Habermas. He doesn't really subscribe to the ideal, as it were, of deliberative democracy in that sense, that because he believes that certain things are not being spoken about, and that's the kind of things that he's trying to get into public attention. He does, I think it's true to say, use his high public profile, to his own benefit, basically. But I would not go as far as, which some people would say, to dismiss him because he happens to be a high-profile media philosopher. That's what I wouldn't say that's the case.
Do you think when you use that phrase about to be born to the world, when you're contrasting him with Habermas and the deliberative, do you think there may be some traces of Hannah Arendt's more viva activa, that he wants, perhaps this is why the provocation comes, is because he wants us as humans in our spheres to be acting, not just...
Okay, if I was to look at the influence on Sloterdijk, Hannah Arendt wouldn't be one. I think that you would notice very, very often coming up in his works. There are other theorists who I have mentioned who are much more prominent in them, I think. But I think what you have to understand is that he's not really seeing his philosophy as a kind of program of action. That's not what he sees as his role. And in that sense, that's the contrast with the Frankfurt School, because the Frankfurt School, the idea behind it is, its philosophy should be leading to action, or is about looking at action from that perspective. But I don't want to be, to misconstrue Sloterdijk's idea. It's just that he wants to be seen in a different way from, that kind of project, which is what the Frankfurt School was about.
Okay, so I was just been thinking about, these theories, Sloterdijk and Michel Foucault.
Yeah.
Michel Foucault, in terms of, if you look at something like Plural, sphereology.
Yeah.
Sorry, if I'm not getting it.
Yeah.
And Michel Foucault's idea of indiscipline and function,
yes. Yeah.
where he's looking at the configuration of power in space. So, do these works correlate?
Yes. When I briefly talked about influences, I left out the influence of French philosophy, but actually it's very strong on Sloterdijk. He's written a book on Derrida, called Derrida, an Egyptian. There are a lot of references to Foucault in him, and as I said, Foucault's later works, such as Care of the Self and so on, where he's looking at the self and the skepticism, that's very much there. As far as spheres is concerned, yes, you can read that, and I think you can see parallels to Foucault and to Deleuze in there as well, actually. So there is definitely. If you're thinking about, is Sloterdijk really a German philosopher? Well, actually, he's probably more closely drawn to France rather than Germany, I think, although Nietzsche and Heidegger have an influence on his works. But definitely, yes, Foucault's influence is there. He does directly refer to it at various points, and as I say, he's actually, I believe he is a chair of philosophy at Strasbourg as well, so he's very much influenced by French thought. The parallels are definitely there, yes.
I've got just a question a little bit about the enlightened false consciousness that you mentioned.
Yeah.
I just wondered, you were sort of mentioning different spheres, I'm not sure if I've just mixed up the two sort of things, but when he goes on, he sort of says that the enlightened false consciousness with is it like cynicism, but is it is that how you
There's two kinds of cynicism, yeah.
Yeah.
Enlightened false, yeah.
Are they kind of two sides of the same coin, almost like dialectical, or are they two separate spheres almost? Do you have
they've become two separate spheres. I think that's the point, the point of cynical reason, that, what he's trying to do, if you like, is rescue critique. I'm maybe using quite a strong word there, actually, by reintroducing, this idea of clinical critique, which in some sense has been lost, and that's what he's trying to bring in as a counterbalance to the kind of, the problem, as it were, of enlightened false consciousness, where people, have this kind of barrier to enlightenment. And as I said, it comes from below rather than above, which is emphasizing the the body, the lived experience, and as epitomized in the figure of Diogenes. So yes, there's a strong element, I would say, of irony, cheekiness, even mockery in Sloterdijk's works, which definitely come from that tradition. He doesn't want philosophy to be entirely serious, I think. That's my impression. Certainly hearing him speak, that is the tone in which he tends to operate. And again, that annoys some people who want to see theorists and philosophers as entirely serious people. But I don't think there's a necessary a contradiction between a kind of clinical impulse and being a serious philosopher, because Diogenes was a serious philosopher in one sense.
I have a question from the board, and this is kind of following up the question, a couple of questions that we've already touched on, one about translation and another one about the place of subjectivity and actually the human in Sloterdijk's work. So this is a question about the tensions between subjective mediation entailed by expressing oneself in a verbal language and the attempts in the context, or in the content, excuse me, to devise a totalizing or universalizing framework, which seems to be an ambition which is evident in Sloterdijk's writings.
Yeah.
So this is sort of half a comment, half a question.
Right.
But could you speak about the question of totalization or the question of universalism within this work?
Okay. Well,
that's a big one.
I think there is a critique. There's a critique of universalism in there, because if we look at macrosphereology, I think what he's trying to do in that is really show the kind of innate instability of all these kind of imaginings of the world, you know, and the idea of that, you know, this permeability, if you like, of spheres, including macrospheres, you know, and this seems to, you know, to set this in the times that we are talking in now, which is to move away from theories which, you know, try to explain the entire world, to more to do with, you know, what is it like to inhabit these kind of temporary places, if you like, you know, of instability. So the themes of instability, you know, temporary nature, those are very much themes of Sloterdijk's work, and I think that would definitely be an implicit critique of a kind of totalizing idea, which is inhabiting, you know, a permanent structure. There is no permanent structure, and you know, the examples we're given where people, you know, have to move from one structure into another. That's what he means by foam city, really. You know, it's this constant movement within spheres, you know.
This is a question just of my own, and I'm thinking about the relation of this work to some other things that I encounter in my own work, which are frameworks like the Deleuzian rhizome, or everywhere, the network, right? The rhizome might be construed as a network, but we also have in someone that is often compared with Sloterdijk, I think, mostly favorably, as in Simpatico, Bruno Latour, with actor network theory. We also have Jacques Rancière, for example, thinking about not consensus, but dissent, and dissensus.
Yeah.
So in all of these kinds of frameworks, it seems to be not about drawing circles of any sort around things, that these models in different ways, but all depend on kind of mobility, nomadicity, crossing, and a different kind of contingency, maybe. Yeah. Could you speak to the relation between those broad, or maybe one or two of those?
Well, I mean, just to focus on nomadology and, you know, the movement of the self. If you look at the chapter from World Interior Capital, and the book itself, that theme is actually, you know, very much in that. I mean, you can call it globalization if you wish, but, you know, Sloterdijk, I say, wants to avoid the term globalization and talk about sphereology. So the idea of the self, you know, and, you know, the idea of migration, nomadology, the relationship between place and self, those are definite themes in there, and they would, you know, have parallels, I think, with work of Deleuze. But one theory you didn't mention, which I think is very important for Sloterdijk, and I think he's actually said that when I gave a paper at a conference where he was presiding, and that is the work of McLuhan, because, you know, McLuhan is a definite influence on Sloterdijk, and, you know, he definitely he's referring to McLuhan several times. And when I was talking about the Phonotope there, this idea of hearing, you know, and this idea of, you know, experiencing a connection with the world from a place, that is definitely an influence on McLuhan, which is quite strange, really, because amongst theorists, with the exception of Baudrillard, perhaps, McLuhan is not someone who automatically springs to mind. But I think to understand Sloterdijk's media theory, you really have to understand McLuhan. And I think there's also perhaps even a parallel in style between the two, actually, because some of Marshall McLuhan's writing is very much of that kind, isn't it? Which is making connections with things which don't apparently have any connection.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of the stylistic similarity, but I've actually just been reading McLuhan, especially the later stuff. And yes, absolutely. That's now really visible to me.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mention we actually work in a communication and media department, and we do still teach our students McLuhan, although he tends to be almost rejected these days. But actually, if you look at Sloterdijk, and I don't think you can really understand his views on media without looking at McLuhan, really. And he does expressly recognise that, I think, in the works.
So here's a question: what gap is Sloterdijk filling? What is it about his ideas that has traction now? Why are we suddenly translating everything into English now? What do you think his purchase on the contemporary is? Okay,
well, if I in terms of gap, if I use the thing which he said at the beginning, at the beginning of spheres, which is you've got being in time, but you haven't got being in space, because Heidegger didn't really complete that, or it wasn't an aspect of the thought. So I think that the gap, as it were, is to connect Heidegger's work with a kind of broader tradition in terms of and why it's particularly relevant now. I think one of the subjects of our lecture is ecologies, that people are using his work to look at some of the problems of environmental planning, architecture, design, etc., in a way perhaps that goes beyond the kind of conventional perspectives. So I think that's the reason for the sudden interest in his work. But as I said at the beginning, sudden interest really is only making up for a lack which was previously in existence, because many of those who knew about his works and could read them in German, we knew of their importance, and in other countries, French translations, Dutch translations, and so on. But in the UK and in the English-speaking world, it didn't exist. Now, I think people have realised that they were missing out on something, and they have now begun to be translated.
So I have kind of a comment or a topic, and this is from someone who's thinking about the relationship between patients and carers in hospital environments. So it's a very concrete application. And the comment is this: the pre-admission person differs to the post-discharge person. The space of the hospital is a constant structure throughout, and I can see where the foam relationships occur in these transitional spaces. I'm interested in the question of transitional spaces, and also that I wonder if you could speak to, in this example, the hospital as a sphere. Does that sphere change? Does the patient change? What is actually transitioning here when we change status like this?
Right, yeah, well, I think this idea of being incorporated in a sphere, being in it for a period of time, and experience some kind of comfort, and then going out from that sphere into an exterior world. I think the idea, of the patient coming in, being cared for, being part of that world, and being expelled. I mean, if we look at the examples, both of which are taken from the book there, the bubble in the Bosch painting, where there are two people in it, and one of them is being expelled, and probably is uncomfortable at that, and then the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. So this idea that we're constantly moving from structures in which we feel a kind of subjective interior feeling, and then going outwards into an exterior world. I think from the point of view of patients' care in hospitals, that is an element, from my experience certainly of hospital care. Sometimes that is not taken into account, you know, these kind of feelings where people are coming into something, being part of it, and then, you know, going out into an unfamiliar world, and how these changes take place. I would say that's... You know,
sounds very much like being born. The act of being born, going from one to another, and change, it starts very early.
Yeah. Well, the gynecological metaphors are a lot in Sloterdijk, and the work, which hasn't been translated yet, to Welt kommen, to Sprache kommen, come to the world, come to language. That's quite an early work of his, you know. That's a key one, you know, in terms of where he uses these gynecological metaphors. And you notice in the anthropogenic islands there, you know, one of them is you know, those kind of feelings, you know. So what these concepts are trying to do is find a way of mapping feelings, you know, and atmospheres without reducing them to some kind of quantifiable thing which neglects the kind of nature of human experience. You know, that's what he's trying to do.
But it's funny that you mentioned being born, though, because I was thinking precisely of not being born, but of going to hospital to give birth, right? And actually, the thing I'm thinking too about that Escher image, where the sphere is in some way a reflection of the self, and the self is actually in a process of change when you're going to hospital, probably for anything, not just to give birth, I would imagine. That you go in with something that is about to be changed, and you go in a particular state with a set of expectations, and you leave materially probably as a different sort of biological person, and also, but also subjectively, you've become a different kind of person. You are someone being discharged, not someone being admitted. You are someone with you know, a child or you know, a cure or something, you know, whereas before you were someone.
Yeah, you have been changed. Yeah, and you know, that kind of idea. I mean, actually, not just in the gynecological, but one of the areas we haven't talked about, which I think is most important, is the kind of media space idea. So one of the spatial entities which we're in most of the time, including now, of course, is so-called cyberspace. And you know, the idea of, you know, negotiating with cyberspace, you know, being part of it and then withdrawing from it, and you know, many people have these mediated identities, and you know, the Escher image, you know, I think Sloterdijk's idea is, even when we're confronted with our media self, in some way, you know, there's a kind of an other there, you know, which we're constantly in this relationship with, even if that other is actually, you know, a kind of construction of cyberspace, really, and the internet. Yeah, I just put on the slide at the end there a few works which have been published in English, with volume Sloterdijk now by edited by Stuart Eldon, and Jean-Pierre Couture's book on Sloterdijk, both of those published by Policy Press. And there have been a few collections of articles in those volumes there, which got various contributions on him, basically.
Okay, so I want to go back quickly to something that you and I were talking about earlier, and that is the relationship between politics, in this case, and philosophy. Because the reason that Sloterdijk has been in the press, and we're taking a very sharp turn but the reason that Sloterdijk has been combative, I think, in the press is because he has said some things that people find politically dangerous. And, you know, I myself, and I think I said this earlier, I kind of assumed that most of the academics I encounter, philosophers I read, have more or less the same politics that I do. That's naive and totally wrong, right? But it's still my working assumption most of the time, unless I explicitly interrogate it. What do you see as the relationship between these potentially contentious political statements and the very abstract philosophy that we're talking about today?
Okay, well, these issues, of course, are very much central to, you know, German philosophical history, particularly. Okay, I mean, as I said earlier on, we have this public sphere in Germany where intellectuals do come out into it and make interventions. And I think that's a good thing. It does lead to controversies. It leads to polemics, but there are debates, which perhaps there are not elsewhere. Sloterdijk's position on these issues, as I say, I think what one has to do. I don't want to do disservice to Peter Sloterdijk and oversimplify this position. It is wrong, I think, to just read the person and the work in an entirely kind of convenient way. There are tensions between the two, and some of the things he says, certainly I personally disagree with them, and some of those things lead people to dismiss him as a philosopher. But I think that is wrong. There are certain of his works which you could probably say are not all that significant because they're too much of that kind of polemic. But the most significant works, some of which I've mentioned today, I do think they are a contribution. But that issue of the personal politics and the expression through philosophy, of course, is a complex thing. But basically, Sloterdijk is making it uncomfortable for us if we want to come up with a kind of easy solution to that problem, which is not the case when you're dealing with his work, I think.
And that's the strategy of several philosophers, right? I think that certainly Slavoj Žižek makes it uncomfortable for us in lots of ways. Alain Badiou, we spoke about. And it is uncomfortable to have to work through certain parts of the work and then encounter other parts and say, I guess I'm not going to discuss that one or read that one, or what do I do with meta-ethics? And there's something that produces tension for me intellectually, and it produces, I think, sometimes a cognitive dissonance. Yeah, it can be. That dissonance can sometimes be productive in the sense that you're being forced, if you like, to look at things in a different way. There are philosophers who perhaps don't, adopt that kind of style. And as I said, some people are definitely put off reading Sloterdijk by the idea, this is the style that he's using. But I think if you look at these works, these major works, and you give them the credence that is necessary, you can see that he is making a major contribution. I don't like to put people in ranking orders and so on, but I do think he is a major theorist of the same kind of stature as those kind of names that you mentioned, I think. I have one last question from the message board, and then we're about out of time. So this is with respect to constructing otherness in cyberspace. Would you say that our real-world physical existences, for Sloterdijk, or within his mode of thinking, are somehow more authentic than virtual ones? Or does this way of thinking, does his philosophy allow us to think more capaciously about the relationship between virtual worlds and physical worlds? Yeah, I think so. I hope I've given the accurate kind of thing. If you look at macrosphereology, for instance, that is the reason why he's taking such a wide scope, I think, on matters like media and so on, to precisely get us away from that kind of way of thinking in which we can be sure that this is the kind of anchored real world, and there is the world of cyberspace or whatever. Through going back in history and through connecting things in this way, I think what he's trying to do is to get us to move away from that kind of conventional splitting of the world in that way. He's not, I wouldn't call him a cyber theorist in the sense of, but as I said, McLuhan, certainly the influence there. And in my field, media communication theory, I believe that, this has got major significance for that. Because, many of the kind of issues that we're facing now in the so-called digitized world, I think Sloterdijk's got something to say and contribute on those issues. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for a wonderful lecture and a wonderful discussion. Thank you all for being here. Again, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. Thank you. Okay.